Hello, my name is Karin Hellaby and I'm delighted to be here as a guest of Landauer to film some videos for you showing techniques from my 10 books. I actually come from the UK and I have a shop about an hour and a half out of London, which I've had for 22 years. I love teaching. My degree is in teaching and I have been teaching for 40 years. My books are distributed by Landauer in North America, but they are also distributed worldwide. The technique I'm showing today is from my book, So Simple Pineapple. The technique started because when I'm teaching in a class, I often see students struggling with a particular technique. And the traditional way of doing So Simple Pineapple is to use either paper piecing or to use rulers with strange angles, which some people can struggle with. Watching this with the students, I decided to develop a method of using squares for pineapple, and this is what I'm going to show you today. This makes it so much easier, and it is a technique which I call a pointless technique because there are no matching points in the whole technique, which makes it very easy. Let me get started. The first thing I'm going to do is to show you the two squares that are used for the beginning of the technique. Now the squares are actually the middle of the block, and if you look at the pineapple here, the table runner here, the block here, you can see the center of the square, and this is where we're going to start, and we're going to start working from the center out. The first thing you need are two contrasting squares of fabric. On the reverse side of the contrasting squares, I've marked an X, just using a pencil to mark an X from corner to corner. Two straight lines. This is then placed right sides together on the contrasting square, and to keep them together, I often iron them because the cotton sticks together when it's ironed. I then stitch a 1/4 inch seam all the way round the square with no openings whatsoever. Here is one I've done earlier, and you can see the 1/4 inch stitched all the way round the square, 1/4 inch from each side. I then take the square and I pull it apart like a tea bag. I call it a tea bag rather than a coffee bag because in England we prefer to drink tea rather than coffee. Once I've done that, I make a little crease just on the X like this, and I take a pair of sharp scissors. I love these scissors. These are scissors by Karen K. Buckley, and they cut right to the point, which makes them very easy to use for this technique. I then cut into that crease, and I cut to all 4 corners. Here you can see it cut to the 4 corners, and you can see that the triangles will then open up. So I'm going to press these triangles, and once they're pressed, the square looks like this. Now you have to be a little bit careful when pressing here because these squares are actually on the bias. So when I press with this, I either use a best press technique or I use a steady Betty, which I'm going to show later in the video. I like to trim the ears before I go further, so these fabric ears can be discarded. I then take a contrasting square of fabric that is a contrast to the outside triangles. I mark this again on the reverse side with an X, corner to corner with the pencil marks. I then position the new square on top of the original square of patchwork. Now it's important at this stage to sew from the new square side. If you don't sew from the new square side, you'll find it's not quite as accurate. But the new square is very accurate because it uses a cutting chart that is in the center of the book. So here we have a cutting chart using 2.5 inch square to start with, 3.5 inch square, and the 4.5 inch square. And you can see the different squares that need to be cut at each stage to help you along. Now again, we proceed in exactly the same way. We stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the new square side all the way round. And what we then do is to pull it apart like a tea bag and to cut into all 4 corners. And this time when we open it up, it looks like this. So just to take you back, what I've done is to simply stitch round all 4 sides, cut into the corners, open it out and press. I like to again remove the fabric ears. I then take a contrasting square of fabric, which in this case will be the pink. You can see the pink goes to the blue to the pink. Again, I mark the X, I place it right sides down, and I proceed exactly as I've done at each stage. Sewing from the new square side, pulling it apart like a tea bag, cutting into all 4 corners, and this time when I open it up, it looks like this. And then we carry on with another contrasting square, placing it right sides down, stitching round, and carrying it exactly the same way. And this time when I open it up, there is a block that I can use. So this makes the pineapple technique much easier by using squares rather than paper piecing or rather than using strange rulers. I'm now going to show you a couple of examples of how I've used the block. One thing I'd like to show you at this stage is that if you want to carry on with making the block larger, what I suggest you do to get the measurement of the next size square is to measure from here to here, in other words the old corners, and measure from here to here, and the common measurement will give you the size. So for instance, if this measured 8 inches and this measured 8 inches, the new square you would cut would be an 8-inch square. I'd like to show you a fun quilt which uses a cow as a motif in the centre and then contrasting fabrics round it. Now with this particular quilt, we actually started off by sewing 10 blocks. You can only see 9 in this quilt. So what did we do with the 10th block? We decided to grow it and see what would happen. So we kept adding more layers so that the block got bigger and bigger. When it got to a certain size, we noticed that it fitted the back of this quilt. So the 10th block became the reverse side of this quilt. In other words, a reversible quilt. Let me show you by turning the quilt round. So here we have the 10th block, and you can see that it looks exactly as the first one at the front of the quilt, but then you can see the extra layers that grew larger and larger to make the reverse of the quilt.